This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so welcome back to another week, and we're going to be walking through how to plan a lesson today. So very soon you guys will be starting to instruct, right? Or for those of you who haven't been assessed for your instructing a 30-minute lesson last year or this year for level fours, it's going to be the first time. But for level fives who are in here, right, you may have already been assessed or you may need to still complete the assessment because COVID kind of cut things short. So we'll be going through with that. So the first step of that is obviously planning a lesson. So I'll walk you guys through the steps of planning a lesson and basically how we get started. All right, so this will be posted in the Google Classroom afterwards for you guys to reference. And for the first half, what we're going to do is I'm just going to give you an overview of the lesson plan and then how to actually like the formatting of the lesson plan. In the second half after break, we're just going to work through on building a lesson plan together on a sample lesson. All right. So why learn about lesson planning, right? So a well-taught lesson obviously needs a very thorough planning, right? So if you don't have a really planned lesson, you pretty much don't have structure to your lesson and what you're going to cover, right? So a lesson plan is crucial to making sure that you're covering everything that you need to talk about for a particular lesson and that you have the appropriate aids that you need to help make teaching the lesson more effective while also making sure that you have something to fall back on as an instructor whenever you need to teach, right? So that's what the lesson plan is there for, right? So lesson planning, as I said, ensures organization and structure of a lesson, right? So basically it gives you a breakdown of what you're going to cover inside your lesson and exactly how you're going to cover it. So it's an important skill that you learn as a cadet that will be useful in your day-to-day lives, right? So for example, sometimes you may be planning or working on a presentation for a project in school. So sometimes lesson planning, the skills that you use in lesson planning is also very applicable to whenever you're preparing for a presentation, right? So it's very transferable in that sense, and it helps improve your presentation skills. Right, let's see. So I used to present a lot back then, so teaching is an easy task for me. Getting the students to participate is like telling my cat to speak. Very true. Right. So the more you practice these skills, right, the better you get at it, and it's more easy to do when the task comes up, right? Whenever you have to do it. All right. So we'll walk through how to do this. So this lesson, I'll walk you through how to use a lesson plan in preparation for your lesson. All right, so the lesson plan, right? So a lesson plan serves as the main guide for when you're teaching a lesson. And the things that it will include will be key teaching points and information for the lesson, instructional reminders for the instructor to focus on when teaching, and also instructions on how to conduct activities or use the resources found in the instructional guides, right? So when you're building up your lesson plan, you're pretty much going through what the instructional guide is asking you to present in terms of the content. The instructional guide is the basis of where the content is coming from. But the lesson plan is giving you more of weaving that instructional guide, some stuff from the instructional guide into your lesson plan to guide you as to when you're delivering the lesson. Right, so it's not necessarily a carbon copy of your instructional guide, but it is a guide for how you're going to conduct your lesson and anything that you need to keep you as an instructor engaged with and familiar with what you're going to be doing during your lesson. Okay, so this is the lesson plan template that the cadet program uses. All right, so if you're not familiar with it, I will walk you through what each little box here represents and what goes into each box. Right, so here, this is basically this identification and lesson information box. This is where you're just going to give the general information about your lesson. So who's teaching the lesson, the date you're going to be teaching it on, the EO number. So like today, for example, I'm teaching you EO number C409.01, right? So that would be going here. And then the title would be plan a lesson, right? So all of that stuff will be found in the instructional guide. So your EO number and then the EO title. And then however the instructional guide specifies on the teaching points, you'll list the teaching points here. right? The duration, however long it's going to take. So for this lesson, it's 60 minutes. So it's covering 2 periods. So 2 periods of 30 minutes. So for me, if I was to put this into a lesson plan, my lesson plan would say 60 minutes in this category. Performance statement is basically what the cadets will be expected to achieve at the end of the lesson, right? So that's what the cadets will be done. So what is the goal of the lesson pretty much, right? That's the performance statement. So that's what you'd fill in into that box. The standard would be how, like the conduct of the lesson, of like how you want the lesson to be conducted to what standards. So are the cadets going to be doing a particular activity being arranged in a certain way, or etc. We have 2 periods as usual. So we go from 6:30 to 7:30. Right. So the conditions is basically how you want the class to be set up, right? Under what conditions do you want the cadets to be seated in a certain way, or do you want the cadets, or like how, basically the overview of how your lesson is going to be conducted, right? So under what conditions are they going to be seated in a semicircle? Maybe you're going to be teaching it in this environment and so forth. That's what's going to be pretty much going inside the conditions. Test details. A lot of, if some sections of the IG will have like performance checks. So if there is, and it's specified in the instructional guide that there is going to be some kind of an assessment, this is where the test details will go under and what the test will cover. The trainees level, when you'd specify what level you're teaching to. The methods are pretty much that what teaching method you are. So I believe that we went over this in a few lessons ago with another instructor, how you can have like different formats of or instructional methods such as interactive lecture, a game, in-class activity, group discussion, etc. So for whatever methods that are going to be used throughout the lesson, that's what's going to be going inside the methods box. All right, so for this one, it's going to be pretty much like interactive lecture for my lesson and an in-class activity in the second period to help. So those are the two methods that I'm going to be using. Training aids, right? So there's training aids and you have learning aids. So training aids are resources that you as the instructor are going to use to help make your teaching more effective. So those are training aids, right? So say you're going to be using a whiteboard, or in this case, in a virtual format, you're going to be using PowerPoint. That's a training aid, right? Sometimes training aids can double as learning aids if they're able to be effectively used to help cadets in their learning process. So a learning aid is a specific resource that will be used to help cadets learn the content more easily or better, right? So that's the difference. So training aid, an instructor will have a training aid to help them teach the lesson. Cadets will have a learning aid to help them learn the lesson. References, this is also specified in the instructional guide about pretty much what exactly, where the information is coming from. It'll cite the references for most of the time. So for example, for aviation lessons, it'll come from the textbook from the ground up, and they'll specify where exactly the information is coming from. And pre-lesson assignment, this category is pretty much if there's anything that needs to be done before the lesson, that's what you'd specify the details for that assignment in this section here. Any material needed for the lesson. So basically any resources that you're going to need for the lesson. So if you need any whiteboard, if you need chalk, if you need computer, and so forth. Maybe if you're conducting a survival lesson, maybe you need tent, right? Maybe some wood, some yarn, or something like that to help you with your lesson. So any materials that you'll need, you'll specify that here in the lesson. Right. Classroom setting, that's how you want to position your class. Are you going to be seating them in threes and rows, semicircle for visibility, and so forth? So how do you want your classroom to be set up? Are you going to be setting it up with the board, with all of cadets facing the board, and so forth? Basically how you're going to be orienting the class. Orientation board, not very much used, pretty much, unless if like you're displaying the name of the lesson. So the orientation board is like if you want to like put on like an easel or like a piece of like Bristol board specifying what the lesson is, that would be the orientation board. So the orientation board would pretty much have summed up who the instructor is, the dates, the EO number, the title, the duration, performance statement in that section. So it condenses that there. Any questions so far? Okay, so next we have the review and approach here. So this review and approach box will cover anything that needs to be reviewed for the lesson. So maybe there's a previous lesson that may be applicable to this current lesson that you're going to be teaching. So you'll specify any details that you need to go over, any concepts that you need to review before you get into the actual meat of your lesson. Right? The approach is however you're going to set forth to teach the lesson. Right? So you'll identify the methods and why you're using those methods. Exactly like the teaching methods. So if you're using an interactive lecture, you're going to explain why you're using that and how it benefits the learning experience of the cadets. That's pretty much what goes in this box. Here in the introduction, you're going to list your teaching points and what they're going to cover, the importance of your lesson, the why, where this lesson fits in is like the where, and then how you're going to conduct, the overview of the conduct of the lesson and any precautions. So safety precautions you might want to specify, or anything would go in this box, where this lesson fits in. So in this lesson, I'm using my lesson as an example. All right, so I explained to you the importance of why you want to plan a lesson, where the lesson fits in, so in your cadet careers, as well as your personal lives in school or whenever you're creating presentations, and basically how we're going to conduct the lesson. So I specified that in the first half, I'll walk you through the lesson plan and the format of the lesson plan. In the second half, walk you through how to actually build a lesson plan based off of a sample lesson. Right? Control statement and test details. Right? Control statement is basically what you expect of the class. The expectations may be that they're not talking or that they can participate as freely as they wish. And that would be what the control statement would be. Test details, you give them any information about a test. So for this lesson, right, there is going to be some form of assessment in PO 409. So you'll be expected to plan a lesson in the future, near future, and then also instruct the lesson. Okay, so this one stage, this is basically where you get into the content of your lesson. So here, each stage would probably correspond to a teaching point. So if you have maybe 2 teaching points and you're covering the first teaching point, this would be stage 1 of 2. You have the introduction for the teaching point, however long that the teaching points is going to take, and the action, basically what's going to be happening during this time, right? So what you, the instructor, will be doing, what information will you be passing on? Question, where do I find out where my EOM code is? So like if you're trying to look out, like if you're looking in the instructional guides and trying to find it, is that the question? Yes, for the lesson. So right off the bat in the instructional guides, it will be listed. So the instructional guides break down each performance objective into an EOM numbers as well. So say for this example, the PO or the performance objective is PO 409, right, which is pretty much instructional techniques, right? 409.01 is the EOM number for this lesson, right? So the EOM is broken down into PO, so 409.01, 409.02 onward. So the instructional guide will break it down into those categories for you and by the title as well. Right, so we'll walk through that process in the second half when we're actually creating a sample lesson together. All right, so the body, this is where the bulk of the content will go. The bulk of the content will go inside this section. So any important and relevant information that needs to be stated in here for the lesson, pretty much go into the body of this lesson, and we will cover that, specify how long it's going to take you for that, and each time the action. So maybe anything that you're going to need as an instructor to carry through for this section, and any reminders that are necessary. Confirmation will include any confirmation questions or any confirmation activities that will be conducted to summarize the teaching point and help consolidate the learning for the cadets. Right, so once you've covered all the stages, this for as many teaching points as you need, you'll repeat this stage and so forth and so on until you've satisfied all the teaching points and you've went through each introduction body for each teaching point, and you'll cover that. But then after you're done that, you'll reach the end of lesson confirmation. So here, the instructional guides will also specify that. where if you have any end of lesson confirmation questions, you'll put them in here. Exactly, you're going to introduce what you're going to be doing for the confirmation, however long it's going to take, and any key reminders or actions that need to be taken by the instructor during this portion here. Right, so if you have any activities for the end of confirmation, you'll also put that in here, and you'll get the details in here and any key instructional reminders that you'll need as well. Any questions so far? Perfect. All right, so then you come to the conclusion of your lesson, where basically you're going to overview any of the safety precautions that you had for this lesson, right? You're going to restate the why from the introduction. So whatever the reason for the lesson that you specified in the introduction, you'll also cover that again inside the conclusion. You'll give a summary of what you've taught inside that lesson. So a very brief summary going through, okay, we covered this and this and that and so forth, just to make sure that you're kind of making sure that you can weave everything together from all the separate parts of the teaching points into one encompassing statement to sum up the lesson. Remotivation. So in this remotivation section, you'd give constructive criticism for the cadets. So statements such as "great job," "you guys did a great job in this class," you'd specify that in the remotivation section just to get them a bit more confident that they've learned the material and that they did a good job in taking in the material. Right? If you have any handouts, the instructional guides will also specify if you have any handouts to give out. So you'll specify what handout you'll be giving, and then you'll distribute them to the cadets. And then finally, you'll give an overview of what the next lesson is going to be. So if you know in the teaching rotation or the schedule what's going to come after you, then you'll give an overview. So basically briefly introduce what the next lesson is going to be, and then sum up that this is the conclusion of the lesson in the lesson plan. Make sense to everybody? All right, so important note, right? And this is a very key point. A lesson plan is not just a carbon copy of the instructional guide. Okay, so a lot of times, right, cadets would just copy and paste the IG into the lesson plan, which defeats the purpose of the lesson plan. So the lesson plan is essentially you as the instructor modifying the lesson to suit the way that you want to teach it. The instructional guides gives you the content. The lesson plan molds that content into a form that you want to give it to, right? So that's the key for the lesson plan. So you take what's in the instructional guide and shape it into the way that you want it, right? And then you deliver it to the cadets. So it's not just take from one here and input it into this section here. It's more take what can I improve on from this section, what can I add, what can I remove, right? So the lesson plan, a lot of the time the instructional guides are very full of information. Not all that information is necessarily needed, right? So as an instructor, you have to make sure that you're reading through the instructional guide, being familiar with your lessons, and then also making sure that you're picking out the most important concepts from the instructional guides instead of copying and pasting everything into your lesson plan, and just taking the most important concepts and elaborating on them with your lesson plan and kind of molding them to how you want to teach it in a more understandable way. Okay, so just make sure that you always recognize that the lesson plan is not just a carbon copy of the instructional guide. Big fact. Okay. All right, so that's the first half, right? We're gonna take a brief break, and then we're gonna hop back in to plan a lesson together, right? So when we plan a lesson together, what I'm gonna be asking you guys is that we're gonna go through the process together and place your input, whether via voice or chat, right, as to what we're gonna fill in. So I'll pull up the sample instructional guides as well as the lesson plan template here on the screen, and then you guys will be the ones giving me the content to put into the lesson plan. All right, sounds good. All right, so just so you guys are familiar with the process, right, so that when it comes for the time for you guys to make your own, you're also just as ready to apply the steps and put it in. All right, so feel free to put your creative caps on. right? It may be a generic lesson that you may have learned in level 1 and 2 or 2. So just let's see how we can adapt it when the lesson comes up. So be ready to be creative, right? And just take a brief 10-minute break. Be back at 7:05. Right, so this will be a very basic lesson for the most part. All the lessons that you guys will be assigned to teach for your 30-minute lesson when you're assessed will be very simple, basic lessons that you learn, maybe just along the lines of general cadet knowledge for like at the level 1 and 2 level. So 10-minute break. See you back at 7:05. Good song. Alrighty. Hope we're all back and had a nice break. We're at 7:05 on my clock, so let's get back into it. Great. So just share my screen here again. Okay. So this is our lesson that we will be covering. Hang on, let's see if I can split it that. All right. Can you guys see both the Word document and the PDF here with the instructional guide? Perfect. Okay. So this is our lesson. All right. So we have EOM 107.03, observe rules and procedures for the paying of compliments. All right. So we're going to specify the instructor. We'll say the instructor is the proficiency level 4 class. All right. Date today is December 10th, 2020. All right. So looking off the instructional guide here, right, what is our EO number? What is our EO number? All right, perfect. EOM.
107.03.
Yeah, perfect. So that's our EOM number. Right, so we'll put that in here. So M 107.03. M standing for mandatory content. So that's in a training year. When you see the M and the M designation before any EO number, that means it has to be taught each year. Right. So what would be our EO title? All right. I know this is pretty obvious. It's right in front of us. Our EO title, right, is our observe rules and procedures for the paying of compliments, right? So that would be what would go in here for our EO title. So observe rules and procedures for the paying of compliments. Right, nicely. So now we have our EO title, right? We don't know how many teaching points there is, right? So what we're gonna do is we're gonna scan through, right? Just scan through the lesson, right? Examine how many teaching points do we have. Right, so by scanning through, right, you can see that there's a total of 4 teaching points. Right, so now what you're going to do, you're going to list each teaching point here. So we have 4 teaching points. So teaching point 1, just going to copy this down. Oh, right. We have 4 teaching points. Right, so this is going to be teaching point 1, teaching point 2, teaching point 3, and teaching point 4. Okay, so you're going to list down your teaching points and name them what the teaching points are going to be. All right, so for this part, since these are concrete facts, you can copy this over here as such. All right, we'll go down. You see teaching point 2 here. This is the title of teaching point 2. We can copy that. Paste that in there as well. Go down to teaching point 3. Copy. And you could paste that in here as well. And then for teaching point 4, take the title and also copy that and paste that in here as well. Oh, there you go. So we have all of our teaching points listed, right? So now we know that our duration is also specified here. Our duration is 30 minutes, specified from the top. So we can also fill that in here, 30 minutes. Okay. Alrighty, it's 30 minutes. So now, what do you guys think the performance statement will be? What do you guys think the performance statement would be? Put in suggestions in the chat for your performance statement for this lesson. For the performance statement, anything is good for the performance statement. So what will cadets be able to do at the end of the lesson? Anybody? Yeah. So so the cadets would be able to observe the rules and procedures for paying compliments. All right. So performance statement can be cadets will italicize that. Cadets will observe the rules and procedures. Yes, I will post this on Google Classroom. For the paying of compliments. All right, so there we have our performance statement. All right. All right, next we have the standard, right? So what standard do you want this lesson conducted? Right, so like basically here in this area, what's the expectation? What's the expectation? So in the standards area, you'd want to say, what's the expectation for how this lesson should be conducted? So any idea or any idea what you want to put in there? Put your answers in the chat. Feel free to unmute and also provide any suggestions. Anything? All right, so remember how the standard is basically how you the level at which you want to, how you want the lesson to be conducted, right? So what is expected, right? So we can, if I just can get you guys like started here, it's like you want to say something like, right, so cadets will be expected to understand and be able to apply the rules for paying compliments and so forth. So you could say something like that, right, under the standard, right? Any idea on what the conditions might be for this? Under what conditions are these lessons going to be performed? All right. Anybody? Anything? Any idea of the conditions? Okay, we can come back to that. Okay, so if we look further down, if you want any information about the test details, right? Okay. All right. If you want any idea of what the test details are going to be, where you'll find that down at the bottom in the conclusion section of the instructional guide, right? So they'll say under this method of evaluation section, if there's anything, it'll say something. So like it'll say, oh, this will be assessed in some kind of in the performance check of this under this category according to this QSP, right? So it specified that here. If there says nil, that means there's no method of evaluation. So if the category does not apply inside your instructional guide, you can just simply put NA. All right, so the trainees level, right? Seeing that this is a level 1 lesson, so the trainees level would be proficiency level 1. Right, so that'd be our trainee level. Right, looking at the methods, right? The instructional guide also specifies what training methods you're going to be using, right? So each teaching point will have a certain instructional method that you're going to be using. So in teaching point 1, you see that the method is interactive lecture. Teaching point 2, we also see that the method is interactive lecture. Teaching point 3, we see interactive lecture as well. And then teaching point 4, also interactive lecture. So seeing that interactive lecture is the only instructional method that's being used throughout all teaching points, that's the one that you'll put down in the methods here. So you only need to list one method and it'll be interactive lecture. So just look through the teaching points. Whenever you're doing this, you look through the teaching points. It'll specify what the method is for that particular teaching point. Okay. All right, so references, we jump down, or training aids. So however you'd be wanting to deliver this lesson, so what are you going to be using to make this, as an instructor, to make this lesson more easier for you to teach, right? So in this virtual setting, you'll probably say something like PowerPoints, right? You may use PowerPoint. What other instructional aids do you think that would be beneficial for you to use as an instructor to help you teach this lesson? Right, so right now we're using a PowerPoint or such, right? So what do you think for this kind of lesson, what do you think would be beneficial for you guys to use as a instructional aid? What will make it easier to teach? Anything? Okay, so you could also try maybe something like a video, right? To kind of help you further explain the concepts, right? That video can also serve as a learning aid as well because it will help the cadets learn. right? So you can have videos demonstrating demonstrating the paying of compliments. Maybe a step-by-step list of a handout that you could create, or like step-by-step list or for the procedure. Right, so stuff like that, right? Something that will help the cadets learn it better, something that will help you teach it better. Right, so you could use videos, PowerPoint, right? List is not exhaustive. There's many different options that you can use, right? So etc. It's subject to whatever you think will help make you teach the lesson better, right? So under the references section, right, the references are all the way found at the bottom of the IG, very last thing, right? So this is the reference here. They've taken it from the Canadian Forces Manual of Drill and Ceremonial, right? You'll copy that reference and place it inside your instructional guide. And there you have it. All right, so seeing here, again, for pre-lesson assignment, right, you're basically, whenever you're creating your lesson plan, you're scanning through the instructional guide for this first page, looking for things that you need to include or not. So here, pre-lesson assignment, there's nothing there. So we'll fast track that. You can put not applicable, right? Any material needed for this lesson, right? It doesn't look like you'll need too much, right? Again, you're scanning through the instructional guide here, right? If it specifies that you'll need anything physically, then you'll specify that. But in this, maybe in this virtual environment, you can say maybe something like a laptop, projector, maybe a working camera, etc. All right, classroom setting for this time frame, virtual. Orientation board, because you're not in actual physical space, you won't necessarily need an orientation board. So you can put not applicable for that section there. All right, so that's our first page. Right, so basically by looking through the information in the instructional guide, you'll find a lot of the information that you need to put in this first page can be found. So just scan through the instructional guide and then list whatever needs to be going through in these boxes. Okay. All right, so next, right, we have the review and approach. Right, so this review and approach gives you an approach here, right? It gives you a reason why the interactive lecture was chosen. Right, so it says an interactive lecture was chosen for this lesson to orient them to the various procedures for addressing NCOs, subordinate officers, and commissioned officers, and for paying compliments, right? So that's the approach, right? You can extend on this approach personally if you wish, right? If you realize that there's other benefits to this, why you chose this approach, right? Specify, so put that in bold. So specify the reason for the approach, right? In your own words. Right, so why would you want to use this approach and exactly for what reason? Looking here, there's also no review needed. So there's no review, so you can just leave it at just why you chose the approach. You don't need to explain this when it comes to the actual teaching time for your lesson. You won't need to explain why you chose the approach. This is just for you, right, as the instructor, or if you have to pass on your lesson to another instructor, that they know exactly why you're teaching this as well and why this approach was selected. So it just gives them more background on the lesson. All right, so again, we have the teaching points here. We've listed them, so we could just copy them again down into this section. All right, so we'll list them. Right, you'll cover the importance of the why. Right, it's important here. Also, you'll try to summarize the importance in your own words to the best of your abilities, but the IG has a nice statement there that you can put in there as well. So you can copy this and expand on it as necessary. All right, so this is the where, so where the lesson fits in, right? So you can say something like cadets will need this, need to use this procedure when they are dealing with senior officers, NCOs, etc. So that's where it fits in, right? However, the lesson is going to be conducted. So any precautions needed, there's no safety precautions for this lesson really, right? So you won't need to specify anything, but basically you can say that cadets will be seated in rows. This is just a very vague example, right? Right, facing instructor or something like that. Right, and then control statement would pretty much just be cadets will not speak while the instructor is speaking. And they must raise their hands or type in chat, right? Try to make this as applicable to this right now if they have any questions. All right, so stuff like that. Test details. If your lesson doesn't specify that there's a test, then you don't need to include any test details, right? So now for here, in this part, when you actually get into the body, so we have 4 teaching points. So we'll do stage blank blank. So we get to stage 1 of 4. You'll introduce the teaching point. Right, so you'll copy what the teaching point title is. Right, so you'll introduce the teaching point, take any relevant information from this teaching point. So here, by reading through it, just skim and read through it thoroughly and seeing what you can take out from it and what you can include, any necessary information, and omit any extra details. Okay, since we're running out of time right here, so that's just for that's what you do for this section whenever you're going through your body of the teaching points, right? Read through whatever the content's being presented in the IG, take what's needed and leave what is not. So if it's extra jargon, extra information, right, just keep what you need and then leave the rest in there because you don't want to overfill your lesson plan, right? Also in the body, you also want to include any personal addition to the material. So this can be based off of like your own personal experiences with the subject matter. Right, to help elaborate, right, to help elaborate on what is exactly in the content. So it elevates your lesson from just being what's presented in the IG and brings it to another level because you have another level of expertise that you can speak on. Okay. Right, and then your confirmation, you just when you arrive at the confirmation, you will just copy your confirmation questions. These confirmation questions are key. We'll put them in the confirmation box, such. And then you'll move on to the next teaching point. Okay, so then you'll repeat the process for each teaching point. Read through the IG, take any relevant information, omit any unnecessary information, and then apply your confirmation questions. If there's any activities, put the instructional activity instructions inside the box for the body, how to conduct the activities. And in this box here, include any instructional reminders that you need for yourself. Right, so these instructional reminders can be just to keep you on track with your lesson, or if you want to highlight any key points, right, you can also do that. Right, so just say you want to highlight key point here, right, so et cetera. So you'd also want to include that in there as well. Right, so in this action box, any key reminders that you want to remind yourself to do while you're teaching so you don't forget, you'll put that in there. Okay, then you go through, same step for each teaching point, repeat stage 1 of 4 until you've done stage 4, all 4 stages, so each teaching point. Right, for the end of lesson confirmation, each instructional guide will have this end of lesson confirmation that you can work through. Some of them might not. So if there's no end of lesson confirmation, then you can just specify that the participation in the activity, if there was any activity, will be the confirmation. So in this case, right, the instructional guide says there is no end of lesson confirmation. So the activity that they did in the previous teaching points was the confirmation, then you'll leave it as such. Right, and the conclusion, if there's no safety precautions, you'll also leave that not applicable. Restatement of the why from the beginning. So we had that why section, the importance up top, right? So you can copy that down and maybe expand on it to give it more of a conclusion sound to it inside this section here. Right. In the summary section, you'll provide an overview of everything that you discussed in the lesson in the general sense, very general sense. Right, so just touch on everything briefly, just making sure that you sum up everything that you've talked about in the lesson to bring some closure to the lesson. Okay, remotivate the cadets. You'd say something like, cadets participated very well in this lesson. And were very engaged in the materials, something like that, just to boost the confidence of the cadets. That's what the remotivation statement is. There's no handouts to be distributed according to the instructional guide. Again, if there is anything, the instructional guide will tell you. Okay, so you will just put non-applicable, and then whatever the next lesson is, you'll give a summary. So you'll give a overview. So the next lesson will be EO M107.04, for example, right? And its designated title, right? Taught by blank instructor. So, okay. And then you also specify the time limits. The time limits are listed in the IG for each teaching point. So you'll put that through and make sure that whenever you're teaching it, you abide by those time limits, right? So that you specify it for those 30 minutes. 30-minute lessons should take 30 minutes and so forth. Any questions? So I'll post this on the Google Classroom, All right, so you guys can have access to it. If you have any questions about it during the process at all, just feel free to let me know, and I'll be glad to answer as well. Just a second, let's stop sharing the screen.